Good morning and good afternoon to all of you, wherever you are. I wanted to very much thank you for joining this webinar. My name is Kaveh Gullimpur and I'm the Vice President of International Strategies at the Center for Climate Energy Solutions. And through our project on the Global Stocktake, we've been thinking deeply for the last 2 years or so about the conclusion of the Global Stocktake at COP28 this year. And it's clear to us, and hopefully to others, that whether or not COP28 is viewed as a success ultimately will be decided on the level of ambition and the movement towards enhanced international cooperation, which is the mandate of the Global Stocktake. But that won't be known until after COP28. It's really the action and what happens after the COP28 that will determine whether it's a success or not. And in that context, we shouldn't forget that the outcomes are meant to inform the next round of ambition, whether that's through NDCs or otherwise, and also to enhance international cooperation on climate action. And in that context, I'm very pleased to be moderating this event in which we have an excellent panel of speakers who will provide their thoughts and reflections on a few questions. And in particular, on the technical paper that we would have circulated in advance of this meeting and that we'll speak to shortly. And what we'd really like to know from you, the audience, through the chat function is, which of the solutions of any in the technical paper would you want to see highlighted in the outcomes of COP28 and why? And what needs to be done between now and December to achieve that outcome? You should also consider how 2024 should look as an effective response year to the outcomes of COP28. So in terms of our panel, I'd very much like to introduce them. We have Lorena Gonzalez, who's a senior research fellow at the ODI. We have David Levi, who's an associate researcher at IDRI, and also an international fellow at the UN Foundation. We have Sandra Guzman, who's the general director of the Climate Finance Group of the Latin American and Caribbean, GFLAC. We have Juan Pablo Hofmeister, who's Associate Vice President of Global Climate Cooperation at EDF. And we have Malango Uogo, who's the Managing Director of Zeni Finance. And our panel is joining us from all around the world, so truly international. So a couple of housekeeping rules. First of all, we are recording this event and we will be putting it on Zoom afterwards. If you do have questions, which we very much hope that you do, please post them in the chat and we'll select some of those questions to put to the panel later. And we will also be running an interactive poll for you to offer your views on which of the solutions in our technical paper you are most interested in or that you think would be in your top 3, or to suggest potentially a solution that is not already in our paper. So before I turn to the panel, I'd like to introduce Alejandra Lopez, who's the head of climate diplomacy at Transformer, to give a brief introduction of the work that we've done at CTS in conjunction with Transformer and EDF on the Global Stocktake and to set out some context for our conversation now. So Alejandra, over to you.
Thank you, Kaveh, and hello, everyone. Well, for Transforma, it has been very enriching to work on this project, to work together with C2ES, CDF, and other organizations and consultants to help shape the GST process and, of course, to scale up climate ambition. So I am in charge of presenting you the theory of change behind what we developed, the technical paper that hopefully you've read. The next slide, please. So what we consider is that the GST relates to at least 3 specific tiers. So in this pyramid, you see them. The first one is that to add real value and make a difference, the GST process must send a limited number of clear signals, high-level asks to what parties and non-party stakeholders should do next in order to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. Second, these signals need to include the identification of a defined set of a specific, available, and implementable high-impact opportunities that speak directly to national level policymakers and non-party stakeholders in every country. And third, there could be consolidated technical resources that parties and non-party stakeholders can draw on when developing and implementing their climate actions. All of this should be supported by accessible and scaled up means of implementation. Our technical paper focuses only on the top 2 tiers, and the identification of these clear signals and high impact opportunities was done on the basis of selection criteria that includes the certainty of their impact, their feasibility, the existence of key relevant initiatives that are already working on these kind of solutions, the barriers and synergies with other SDGs. Now, as we all know, specifically for means of implementation, the success of the GST outcome and the very achievement of the Paris Agreement depends on a robust package of means of implementation that is adequate to developing countries' needs in mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. And this package needs to be considered in a broader context of the long-term goal of the Paris Agreement that we know as Article 2.1c, which is making all financial flows consistent with low emissions, climate resilient development pathways. And this is a task that is cross-cutting to many sectors and stakeholders, and that depends on awareness, information, coordination, and action to be taken mostly outside of the UNFCCC process. And this is why our technical paper is including a series of signals of means of implementation that try to go to these other processes also outside of the UNFCCC. So in the next slide, we can see some of the signals that we presented here that relate to increasing the proportion of investments in renewable energy, creating mechanisms for debt suspension, cancellation, or restructuring, increasing the share of grants and highly concessional instruments for developing countries, especially for adaptation, linking fossil fuel subsidies reform to just transition plans, providing capacity building support to developing countries to operationalize Article 2.1c, revising and adjustment investment plans and portfolios of NDVs, IFIs, and private investors to align to the Paris Agreement, and enhancing the understanding, disclosure, and management of climate-related financial risks and opportunities by institutional investors and corporate actors. Now, for the sake of time, I will now present just in a little more detail one example of what we worked on in an area that is now being discussed, debated in different fora, in the more recent, in some weeks ago in Paris. This is an ask for the creation of mechanisms for debt suspension, restructuring, and cancellation, with a view to addressing climate-related needs by bilateral, multilateral, and private creditors. Why is this important? What impact can it have? What's the feasibility of it? Well, first of all, there are a number of initiatives working on this. There are mechanisms like debt for nature swaps that had been regularly implemented for 3 decades now. In 2020 alone, low and middle income countries spent 372 billion on debt repayments. And this is very important in a context of very limited public finance available to be provided to developing countries. And on top of that, well, we have a phenomenon of climate-induced debt that is increasing the cost of capital and reducing the fiscal space to invest in climate action in developing countries, that is coming on top of the overall lack of sustainability or debt crisis in developing countries. So what we're proposing here is some solutions that relate to debt for climate and nature swaps, the cancellation or suspension of debt related to fossil fuel projects or for developing countries recently struck by extreme weather events, so that it is linked too ambitious action in fostering a just energy transition, so that is conditioned or linked to the early retirement of polluting energy plants, mines, and wells, or to address countries' disaster response and recovery efforts. This is what I wanted to show you, just as an example of what we did, and we have a lot of more detail on every high-level ask and solutions in the paper. So in the next one, I'll just pass the mic on back to Kaveh, so to open up this discussion on what needs to happen now, from now till the GST, and then in the years forward for the updating of indices. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Alejandra, in particular, as I think you gave that presentation so well at, what is it, 6 a.m. for you. So really appreciate that. And also those of you online who've joined us early. So Lorena, Alejandra has basically given us a quick run through this sort of theory of change, the building of momentum around solutions to COP28, trying to land signals and then having an effective year of response in 2024 to the Global Stocktake, and has picked one of the examples from our technical paper to illustrate that. Philip, if you could then launch the poll. We're now going to launch a poll that audience members can look at during the rest of the webinar, to vote on what you think are your favorite solutions, and then we'll have a look at the results towards the end. So they should be on your screen. You can double click on them to expand them, and you can scroll through them. So I'll leave that there. Also, if you do have questions, please post them in the chat and I'll try to put them to the panelists later. So Lorena, I'd like to turn to you first, also very early where you are. So thank you again for joining us. I mean, we have a couple of questions here. I mean, which of the solutions, if any, in our technical paper would you want to see highlighted in the COP28 outcome or COP28, and why? Or are there things that you would want to see there? And also, what needs to be done between now and December to get to the point where those solutions could land and we could take them forward next year? So there's not much time between now and COP28, but we need to use it widely. So, tiene la palabra, Lorena.
Thank you, Kaveh. Thank you very much for the invitation and for this paper that C2ES has prepared, which I believe are very timely in terms of pivoting between the technical phase of the global stocktake and what would need to happen in the remainder few months ahead of COP28. And let me just bring to this conversation the fact that June is the hottest month on record, and almost every other day in July we have witnessed record-breaking temperatures. If we take this as a reference point, I believe we can frame the importance of the outcomes of the GST in the context of COP28 in Dubai. And when it comes to the means of implementation, I really like the framing suggested by Alejandra just now in the presentation in terms of the need to have a robust package of the means of implementation that also address the needs that are immediate, while keeping in mind this view of the longer term as included in Article 2 of the Paris Agreement as well. But I would add another point, and I think it is important to acknowledge this expectation that the first global stocktake will acknowledge the significant shortcomings to date, particularly when it comes to finance, and how these have contributed to create further trust deficit in the intergovernmental process, hindering ambition in climate action in the case of many countries. The reality, Kaveh, we have to say, is that we haven't done enough to shift finance flows to low emissions and climate resilient development pathways. At least 4 trillion in climate aligned finance needs to flow to climate action annually, globally, by 2030. But the best estimates put us far off mark at approximately 850 billion. So just throwing these very large numbers into the equation, we can see there are lots of things that the process should do. And I will concur also with this notion that many of these processes, many of these actions would need to happen outside of the UNFCCC. But the fact is that the GST has agency over the intergovernmental process and can also trigger some specific elements of that ambition mechanism designed by the Paris Agreement to go beyond previous efforts in a collective way. So if we understand finance as an enabler and a catalyst for action, the GST political outcomes must elevate the multiple actions required to deliver change at the necessary scale and pace. So now on to the specific solutions in the technical paper. I will refer to two that I consider are of priority for the larger system to work and to be able to deliver in the next 5 years. The first one refers to the concessional finance elements, and the second one to the operationalization of Article 2.1c. So let me start with signal 3 on increasing the share of concessional finance, because I see this one coming hand in hand with the example that Alejandra used in her presentation as well, in terms of debt sustainability issues. The limited concessional finance available for developing countries is a particular source of frustration for the process. So addressing it should be understood as a priority for this first global stocktake. Moreover, the UNFCCC has direct agency on this matter, including through the guidance that the COP gives to the operating entities of the financial mechanism, namely the Green Climate Fund and also the Global Environment Facility, but as well to other funds like the Adaptation Fund that serves the Paris Agreement, and potentially one of the new funds like the one on loss and damage. There are opportunities to seek out and make use of new sources of concessional finance, because we need to acknowledge that currently the levels are insufficient. And while quantity is important, so is quality. So access to concessional finance remains a barrier for many developing countries, and the outcomes of the GST have an opportunity to support the simplification and expediting access to it in a way that is driven by local needs and expertise. Let me now address very quickly the operationalization of Article 2.1c, so the fifth signal included in the technical paper. And this one includes a specific call for capacity building to support developing countries to operationalize Article 2.1c. I would suggest that we need to take a step back and acknowledge the contrasting reality of efforts underway outside of the UNFCCC in implementing Article 2.1c, with the almost absent space for formal deliberations in the climate process. I would suggest that it is urgent to consolidate a shared understanding at the UNFCCC of this being a collective goal that would require to create capacity across the board. The GST outcomes must spur global and national reallocation of capital towards climate solutions. And in this regard, we also need to remember that the climate negotiations for many years have focused on the flow of finance from developed to developing countries. And there is good reason for that. It is embedded in the principles of the convention and also acknowledged in the Paris Agreement. However, I would say that this framing doesn't capture sufficiently how the billions will shift the trillions. And that is the real question that we have at hand. Elements on financial system reform, adoption and implementation of transition plans for non-state actors, and regulatory reforms that align financial policy and fiscal incentives are all part of this puzzle that can benefit from an agreed direction of travel under the UNFCCC. So in this sense, the GST has a unique opportunity to address some of the specific dimensions of this problem. The GST, let me finalize by saying this, I do concur also with the fact that even though a lot of attention has been given to the finance dimension of the means of implementation, it is expected that the GST outcomes would also address in a specific way issues around technology development and transfer and capacity building for developing countries. Only in this way it would be holistic. So let me stop here. I look forward to hearing the other interventions and to the interactive part of the conversation. Cabe, back to you.
Muchas gracias, Lorena. And Lorena, you've highlighted, two of the solutions there: the increased level of concessional finance that's necessary, and also the reference to 2.1c and the fact that the the global stocktake could highlight the need to move forward on that, including some specific aspects, just to be a little bit controversial and maybe provoke some questions through the question and answer function. In the recent session of the SBs in Bonn, we struggled as parties to even agree an informal note under the authority of the co-facilitators of the Global Stocktake, specifically on the issue of how to reference Article 21C. So that it was quite interesting that you raised that one topic that was actually the most controversial in the end, in agreeing those that informal note. So an important point there. So if people do have questions, please do post them using the Q&A function, and also there's a live poll, so please do interact with that. So thank you, Lorena. I'd now like to turn to from Mexico City, or somewhere near Mexico City, to Paris and David Levi there. So David, I'd like to turn to you and for you to share your thoughts. So please, David, you have the floor. I can't see you, but I hope you're there.
I am. Thank you, Kaveh. And first, let me congratulate the team and all your partners for the excellent and comprehensive approach that you've taken over the Global Stocktake and the critical messages. It's been hard to choose what are the most important ones in terms of means implementation, because all of them need to actually come forward. But it's true that at least my perception is that the Global Stocktake needs to really establish or anchor as much as possible links between matters that are discussed in the negotiations and sometimes only in the negotiation and what is happening in the real world, as Lorena was saying. It is critical, and that's clearly represented by the presentation from Alejandra, to send clear and high-level political signals to all type of stakeholders, way outside of negotiations, to capitals, especially to Ministry of Finance and Treasuries over there, but also to public development banks, multilateral development banks, private sector investors. And in order for those messages to be really perceived and taken up at the highest level and shape their view of how to go forward, how to have impact, I think they need to be very well articulated with the key areas that we have been thriving or at least advancing in terms of mobilizing climate finance in recent months. So I will have three fundamental messages that are more or less aligned with the asks, and I'll detail that. I think first is the link between climate and development. Second is the acceleration of 2.1C, and I totally second what Lorena said. I'll get to that afterwards. And third one is the learnings from existing processes, in particular JETPs. So first, climate and development are really the past debate in the past few months, since the help of me and Motley setting the Bridgetown agenda with the Paris summit that was held a few weeks ago. It really triggered that climate and development are not a choice. They're not a trade-off. They're indistinguishable. They're really two elements, part of the same, it's not even two sides of the same coin, it's the same thing. And so the ask number 2 is critical. Addressing that issue in a comprehensive manner in order to expand fiscal space will create the ability to implement ambitious climate and development policies together. So pursuing that effort that has been initiated, but it's very heavy, it's a very heavy lift, it's a very complicated one, very multifaceted, which is a major overhaul of MDBs, the multilateral development banks, IFI processes and procedures is absolutely necessary. So tackling all the debt-related solutions, from restructuring to forgiveness, from debt for nature swap, debt for climate swaps, disaster clauses, addressing service payments. This is fundamental, and anchoring with the agenda that is happening very slowly, but surely somehow at the World Bank and elsewhere is at the G20 is critical. But I think we should go one step further, and that's something that is essential too, is of two sides. One is addressing risk and the perception of risk, whether it's credit rating, whether it's foreign exchange risk, which takes a heavy toll on the ability of developing countries to implement those policies. And second, even more important, is despite debt issues, but despite mobilizing concessional finance, the GST needs to recognize that specific and dedicated revenue generating instruments are necessary. We can't rely only on political will or the lack thereof to actually mobilize climate finance. We need to find tools, instrument, in particular taxes, whether they're domestic and could be included in NDC next time, or international, and will need further negotiation to be established. But this conversation is happening a little bit outside of the UNFCCC. The GST needs to build that bridge and build that tie. The second dimension, to totally second what Lorena was saying, is the acceleration of implementation of 2.1c. It is indeed something that countries have been resisting to do, but the overall conversation, besides in civil society and in governments, is about substituting finance and subsidy for fossil fuels to dollars spent to accelerate the transition. So we need to look at a very holistic perspective and get a focus on net climate finance, not only on how much mobilization is done to support climate action, but how much of that still goes, how much of finance still goes to nasty and destructive activities that kind of reduce the potential and the impact of climate finance. Advancing one, increasing one is not sufficient if the other one is increasing too. It's the ratio that should be centered in our focus. It is critical for the GST to reestablish that, and maybe to call for launching efforts to measure and track this shift fundamentally. And that will be very related to the asks number 4 and number 5 in the paper. And my third and last point is, again, to tie these conversations happening inside and outside the UNFCCC, is to highlight efforts that have been undergoing, but are still too limited, to move from a project approach, a project financing approach in the developing world, towards a total sector or system transformation approach, and recognize that there are efforts already underway. There is a desire to establish country platform at the World Bank and in many development finance institutions. It is emerging, blooming, but it needs to be strengthened. And the Global Stocktake should be able to urge MDBs and IFIs to use the preliminary learnings of the JETP approach as a blueprint for reform, as a help to set up a transformative agenda. There's a lot of things that are being tested right now, and we already have gathered a number of lessons. I'll just pick a few. Focusing on a political vision first to deliver a comprehensive sector approach. This is a new way to do things. It's not about starting with a series of projects. It's starting with a vision. It's also the ability for the integration of climate goals and national development priorities. And that's essential for ownership in countries. And that's essential to also build the improved governance of a long-term process that you need in countries so that efforts are sustained over the long run, but they're done in coordination, in inclusion of all stakeholders of civil society that will maybe benefit or maybe will suffer from these transformation. But the need to align domestic and international goals are at the heart of that renewed approach. The last one is around capacity building. Capacity building is something that is essential, but it also goes both ways. Obviously, in recipient countries, you need to build capacity in order to facilitate those processes, improve coordination, but you need to build capacity in contributing countries, those that are thinking of mobilizing finance to invest in the developing world, need also to change their approach and have an approach that is more system based rather than project based. And that's a fundamental shift. So the Global Stocktake can really illustrate that, put that in the forefront. That's ask number 6, and I think it's critical. And this agenda, because it's already ongoing besides the negotiation, I think being that plug is a way to have a conversation that resonates on the two sides and allows meetings that are not UNFCCC meetings, like the World Bank meetings, the annual meetings, the G20, the Finance in Common Summit, the African Climate Summit, to actually help move the needle and to collect the results and outcomes next year to best benefit from whatever political signal the GST can offer. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, David. You raised a number of points there. Particularly interesting is the connection you made between climate and development in what is going to be an important year for both agendas, but also what is an important decade for both climate and development. And I think it's interesting that I think it's an area of potential common ground, because it's an area that both developed and developing countries, both donor and recipient countries, emphasize as being important in the climate context. So I think that's an important issue, and it's important to think about how the global stocktake might be able to build bridges and accelerate that. As you mentioned, you also mentioned, like Lorena, the importance of Article 2.1c and the acceleration of the transition. And I think also the point around debt and the GST urging MDBs and IFIs to really reform in light of some of the signals they've had. But I think interestingly, both you and Lorena highlighted that there's a lot of stuff happening outside of the UNFCCC, but that there's a real role in the multilateral process and the intergovernmental process for both the UNFCCC and specifically the global stocktake to accelerate some of those things that are happening outside. And the real question is how can that be done? So thank you very much. I'd like to now turn to Sandra, who like me is in London, so not so far away. Sandra, you've heard some of the remarks, and I don't think it will be a surprise to you. I should also remind, we're starting to get some questions through the Q&A function. Please do keep that coming in. We also had a problem with the poll, but we've relaunched that, so the audience, please do interact with the poll again. But Sandra, unless I missed it, we haven't heard about the new collective quantified goal. Maybe someone did mention it, but that's an important thing that's going to be increasingly important for this year and next year, as I understand it. But also the connection, you heard 2.1c coming up a lot of times here, but also the sort of interaction between means of implementation and mitigation and adaptation. I don't know whether you want to speak to any of those things. So you have the floor. Thanks, Sandra.
Thank you so much, Kaveh, and thanks a lot, colleagues, for the invitation. This is a very, very important space, and we're getting very close to this final first round. And I guess I would like to start saying that it is very important to understand the goal of the Global Stocktake, because it's not only an evaluation about what happened in the past, but it's also the aim is to identify those gaps to strengthen climate action in the future. This is quite obvious for us, but if you have been participating in the World Cafes, in the roundtables, there is not necessarily an agreement in terms of what is the goal. Like sometimes there is a discussion, it's all about the past, or we have to actually set a number of elements that will help us, as David was saying, to build those bridges, connecting different processes within and outside the convention. So in that sense, the Global Stocktake, definitely, I agree with my colleagues, it's gonna send important signals, but I would say that it's going to also set the tone of the conversation for next year. And I think this is going to be very important because the comprehensiveness or the robustness of the information that we can get in the Global Stocktake will be very important. One, to close the gaps that we have at the moment. And the second one is to keep building trust. As Lorena was saying, this building trust is going to be a massive point, because if it is not a robust first Global Stocktake, it might be like affecting other discussions in the future. So I think that's why it's so important. Definitely, I would like to congratulate you for the document that you put together. All the solutions are extremely relevant and important. I would like to focus on the two solutions related to the climate finance discussion. And I would like to emphasize that in the climate finance debate, as you know, there are so many connections. Climate finance is not anymore like this silo working by itself, but now it's all connected. No, it's not only about 21C, it's about Article 7 relates to adaptation goal, it's about a loss and damage fund, Article 8, and of course, the Article 9 relates to the provision of climate finance, and Article 13 about the transparency framework that is going to be very important to understand where is the money, to what extent the money has been arriving where it needs to arrive, and a lot of these discussions. But because of the time, I would like to emphasize two elements. So the first one is about Article 9. I think that during the Global Stocktake, it has been very clear in a lot of parties already emphasized that we haven't, the 100 billion haven't been accomplished, even though there are some reports that show that there is a mobilization of climate finance. There is still a huge gap in terms of understanding about where this money has been allocated, to what extent has been complying with the principles and the goals. And I think this is a very important first element that the Global Stocktake has been trying to do. No, let's have a discussion about how much money has been flowing, where has been allocated, and how all this 100 billion experience is gonna teach us some new lessons or lessons learned to now build a whole new collective and quantified goal, which is another layer of the conversation, because it's not only, it has to learn from the past, it cannot be just a political statement, has to be a new goal that is based on needs. And I think this is some of the discussions that we have been having. Unfortunately, in developing countries, we don't necessarily know how much do we actually need to implement NDCs or to implement NAPs. A lot of countries have been doing a very good effort to assess the cost of these needs and these NAPs, for instance, and this has been reflected in the needs report that the Standing Committee on Finance put together. But it's true that we don't necessarily know all that information, and this is the type of gaps that the Global Stocktake has been kind of identifying. So now developing countries can get support to conduct these assessments and to bring this information to the table, not as a condition or anything like that, but just to start building a new goal. It is important to have this information not only from the top down approach, because we have like numbers from the World Bank and the OECD and others, but it's how can developing countries conduct these assessments from the bottom up and bring this information as well. Because I think now a very, very important discussion that we will have is not only about the quantity, because there are a lot of studies that say that, yeah, there's a lot of climate finance flowing, there is increase significantly, but the whole discussion now is about quality, as Lorena was saying, and effectiveness, no? Like to what extent all these financial flows have been actually reducing emission, have been actually reducing vulnerability, who is actually accessing to these resources, because access is another major issue that is part of the discussion in the Global Stocktake. It's true that not all the countries have been having the same opportunities and same access in the different regions. In Latin America, we know that there are 3 main recipients, and from there is a very unequal distribution. But I think in this context of the new goal, the huge debate is also about the sources, no? And is it going to be grant? Is it going to be loans? And to what extent is going to be balance between mitigation and adaptation? And I like that you emphasized the necessity to increase financial flows for adaptation. And this is going to be a very important point, because adaptation is not a matter of the future. No, now we are facing and we are dealing with huge problems in all developing countries, even in developed countries with this hot weather. It's clear that adaptation cannot be just at the end of the queue, and doubling adaptation finance is not going to be enough. And I think the Global Stocktake has to be able to identify those gaps and say like clear messages that doubling adaptation finance is not going to be enough and needs to be like public and not only private, because we know that private sector is not investing in adaptation at the moment. So that I think in the Article 9 in terms of provision, we will need to kind of radically change the narrative towards a more effectiveness approach, and this is going to be one key element. My second point related to Article 21C, I totally agree with my colleagues. 21C it's such an important guiding point for all of us. And I think this is not only about increasing climate finance flows, but it's also about decreasing carbon intensive flows, and more importantly, transforming the financial sector. The financial sector is not delivering, is not able to tackle all the multi-crises that we are living and facing around the world. And this is why it is important to have this conversation in different spaces. For sure, debt is a very, very important debate that we have to tackle in the short and mid-term. And I think this debt discussion has to be also, let's say, framed according to the different contexts of the different countries. It's not all the countries will have cancellations, not all the countries will have swaps, not all the countries will have, so it's under what conditions these mechanisms will be suitable and will be effective. But it's not, I mean, that is just one part of the problem. The whole problem is the financial system. So we definitely need to discuss new mechanisms, new financial schemes to avoid that this debt continues as it goes. No? So because these mechanisms will continue happening if the system keeps operating in the same way. So I think it's not only about tackling debt, which it has to happen now, definitely, but it's how we are going to start debating new mechanisms with the World Bank, with the IMF, with the MDBs, because otherwise we are just going to see this debate coming and going as we have been for many, many years. So in that sense, I definitely think that we have to be able to connect these narratives, what is happening in the context of the UNCCC with what is happening outside. Just to give you an example, in the last World Cafe, we had this conversation about the role of the financial institutions to accelerate climate action. And some parties commented that the UNCCC was not the space to discuss the reforms of the financial system because they don't want to see that discussion happening in the UNCCC. But other people say like, well, countries are the shareholders of these financial institutions. So definitely the UNCCC is a place to discuss these issues as well. It is important to have political debates like the one that happened in Paris, because sometimes that technical debates are not happening in the climate negotiation, but it's important to connect the different conversations and to ensure that these conversations that are happening outside are like actually having effects in the more kind of formal debate. I think that's one of the critical elements that we would like to see from the Global Stocktake, how to connect the dots. And I just conclude with this. I think it's very, very important that the Global Stocktake tends like these branches. No? I see it as a tree with different branches and branches that are connecting the dots within the process, the adaptation goal, the climate, the loss and damage fund, but at the same time connected with external processes. David was already mentioning financing common, Marrakesh, and all the debate in the financial institutions, and all of them have to be connected. Otherwise, we will be continuing the silos without an actual political and technical effect, and that will be very, very damaging for the process itself. So I would like to leave it there. Thank you so much, Kaveh.
Thanks a lot, Sandra. A lot of really good points there, and I was really struck by this emerging theme of all the speakers so far have spoken about how important the external processes are, and that's where a lot of the work is happening and needs to happen. And yet the role of the UNFCCC and the Global Stocktake too, in your words, Sandra, to connect the dots, but also to accelerate what's happening. You also mentioned things like learning from the 100 billion experience to inform what's going to happen on the new collective quantified goal. And also other points such as the doubling of the adaptation finance won't be enough, the need for the Global Stocktake to identify gaps in that regard, but also to offer some more precision in terms of what the finance and support gaps that developing countries are facing to implement and raise ambition, as well as, I think, reinforcing a point that David made, that while debt has to be tackled, it's also some of the underlying systems that need to be changed in the financial institutions and the potential role of the Global Stocktake in that. So thanks a lot, Sandra. We have a couple of questions from the audience. Please do keep posting those through the Q&A, and the poll is still live. So if people want to interact with the poll, please do so. But I'd like to now head over to Washington, DC, and to Juan Pablo at EDF. So Juan Pablo, we've heard a lot about 21C, and you have a lot of experience in your previous role before EDF and in terms of how to disperse some of the climate finance that's flowing. What sort of innovation do you think that we need to see, and what do you want to see on 21C or anything else that you've heard? So over to you, Juan Pablo.
Thank you very much, Kaveh, and good day to everyone. Very happy to be joining you today. So the advantage of coming after people like Sandra and some of the other colleagues that have spoken is that I don't have a whole lot more to say on 21C, but I do sort of pick that as one of the solutions that are definitely worth highlighting. There's perhaps 2 points that I would want to underscore on 21C, in addition to what others have already said. And one is that as part of trying to create momentum on 21C, I think it's important we realize the signals that need to be given around ESG, and the fact that we have done, unfortunately, quite a we're taking quite a detour when it comes to consolidating some of the important gains that we could gain on between the work on ESG and making 21C a reality. So I think that it's an important factor to consider as we go into Dubai. And the signal that could come with regards to continuing the momentum of ESG. The second point with regards to 21C, of course, and I think Sandra just made this point very well, is the fact that we're talking about the larger financial landscape. This is not just about sort of the national climate plans, but it's really around needing to connect how financial markets are moving with how the climate plans are moving. And so 21C is about, that's why I think it keeps coming up, because it's about that really big, it's about that big picture. So with that, let me go into the second solution that I like to highlight and what I think needs to be done. And that goes to the point around revising and adjusting investment plans. And this is an area where I think there has been important progress. First of all, in strengthening how we think about NDCs, strengthening how we think about NAPs, but we still have a long way to go. And I think that this is a solution that needs to be put forward. It doesn't stand alone. This solution, without the proper changes on financial markets, on issues around how we think about debt, etc., doesn't really do anything in itself. But revising and adjusting investment plans comes hand in hand with the need to increase capacity of countries to be able to do it, which will then by default allow them to be able to navigate the complexity of that financial system, to be able to deploy debt restructuring, etc. So I think it was Lorena who said that it's not just about quantity, but it's also about quality in finance. And the only way that quality can come is if we help countries come forward with the capacity to be able to do proper origination, structuring, and de-risking on investment. I very often hear that this discussion is about, like, are we talking about loans or grants? The reality is that it's much more complex than that, but you cannot really enter into that complexity without the proper capacity to do and adjusting investment plans, which comes then next to the point and the need to be able to identify transformative investment. We have become used to the last 30 years on the project approach to investment. We now need to enter into a much more programmatic type of thinking that sequence the way in which we think we program investment, that optimizes solutions for addressing barriers. I believe that it was David who, of course, spoke of the JET-P and the lessons that we're learning with that. I actually like to go even further back. I think that what we learn about programmatic approaches with the climate investment funds taught us around sort of the need of sector-wide thinking. And I think that this is something that we need to bring back in our NDCs, that we need to bring back in our NAPs, etc. Of course, this doesn't go without saying that the way in which the financial landscape operates need to be aligned. And that's why I'm not saying that sort of investing in national plans alone will fix this. In order to be able to determine how to deal with debt, how to deal with some of these new mechanisms, you need to be able to navigate the financial system. I will add that unfortunately, I think that in the last 2 years or so, we're seeing a little bit of a political push towards the creation of new funds, which in themselves are sort of very worthy of their cause. I fear also for the creation of new complexity as we're trying to sort of navigate a landscape of new funds, which are in some instances redundant, and where the coherence of them is not self-explanatory. So this is an important trend to keep in mind. The last point I'd like to make, it's a point that often gets missed, and is the link with the work on means of implementation and technology, which sometimes, you know, we tend to very much in the good culture of UNFCCC think in silos, and technology. I feel it's very important to bring this context, particularly on the push that we have seen in Paris around trying to cement the work of, in countries on building national innovation systems, which are a requirement really for everything else that we have been talking about. National innovation systems are not just about sort of the technology deployment, but it's around sort of making some of these financial solutions endogenous and make them work in the local context. And this is a dimension that needs to be, that goes really hand in hand with my point earlier around strengthening capacity and adjustment investment plans for better origination, structuring, and de-risking of financial solutions. So I'll leave it there, and happy to come back to some of the questions after. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Juan Pablo, and also for not only reinforcing some of the points made previously, but also bringing in some other aspects, including the notion and importance of investment plans to support raising ambition and implementation of things like NDCs and NAPs, but also the importance of capacity building in countries around that to address some of the underlying complexity to both formulate such plans, but also identify opportunities. Also, I think it's interesting that you mentioned some concerns over potential new funds, and to ensure that redundancy is avoided and that there is coherence with what's already there. I think there's something that's a very hot topic at the moment, and also for raising the issue specifically of technology and the need to avoid silos around that. Probably a terrible summary, but we'll post the video online so people will be able to rewatch your intervention. So last but definitely not least, I'd like to go to Johannesburg and give the floor to Malango Mwogo. Malango, you've heard lots of things, and I know you want to talk about things like MDBs and also finance for adaptation and loss and damage and priorities for Africa. A couple of speakers also mentioned the JETPs as a possible area to learn lessons from. I don't know whether you might, given your location, might want to speak to that as well, but you have the floor.
Thanks very much. And yes, I'm based in South Africa, and yes, so I will touch very briefly on the JETPs. But similar to everyone else, thank you so much for inviting me to this really important conversation and the excellent report. And I also struggled to identify prioritized solutions because they've been evidently so carefully thought through, and so they are all relevant. But in deciding on what to talk about today, I thought it was useful in my mind to remind ourselves of a couple of key facts, one of which Lorena's already touched on, which is the principles of equity and common but differentiated responsibility and respective capacities that's enshrined in both the Framework Convention and the Paris Agreement. And sitting again on the African continent, particularly respective capabilities, and the issue of adaptation has come up, for example. There's the University of Notre Dame produces an adaptation index. And interestingly, in terms of vulnerability to climate change across the 185 countries in that index, middle income, low income, high income, it doesn't matter, there's vulnerability there. But when it comes to being able to respond, so responsiveness and ability to address climate change, it's predominantly low income and lower middle income countries that are in the lower part of the index. So they have very low capability to be able to respond. So that really has to be, the global stocktake really has to continue to reflect that, those two principles. And also linked to adaptation as well, I think hopefully the stocktake will also bring out the flows of financing from within countries as well, towards both mitigation, but particularly adaptation. Because again, speaking with a so-called African hat on, research from 2017 by the UN Economic Commission for Africa found that on average, African countries are spending between 2 to 9% of their GDP on adaptation. So this is existing expenditure on adaptation, and that makes up about 20% of what they need in total. And importantly, it's much larger than the amount that they're receiving in international finance flows. So the numbers do not add up. And obviously the fact that money is being spent on adaptation indicates just how important it is to these countries. And then finally, in terms of informing what the solutions that I wanted to look at and think are really important in terms of the outcomes from COP28 and the GST, is private finance and the financial sector. It's already been mentioned, and of course with big proposals such as the Bridgetown Agenda and the recent summit in France, reforms to the whole global financial architecture are top of mind, and I think it's important to build on that momentum. But importantly now, this is coming to for example, the GSTs, which are very important in terms of country platforms to try to create a more programmatic approach to addressing mitigation in the energy sector. So in South Africa, the GST is estimated cost of just over 5 years, over the next 5 years, I think it's about $98 billion or so. And of that, they expect 60% of it to come from the private sector. So that's more than 50%. It's a huge number. So the private sector, and this is not just financial institutions, of course, it's also companies, needs to be placed front and center within a global stocktake, which has already been mentioned, is not typically does not address non-state entities like companies. So I think that's really important that the stocktake tries to do that, especially as I say, countries have identified the need for the private sector to be involved. So in terms of the actual solutions, some have been, the critical areas have, I think, have been mentioned already, but particularly just doing what we said we would do in relation, for example, to the 100 billion that should have been committed by 2020, 100 billion per annum, just making sure that the financing that has been promised is put in place. And in particular around grant and concessionary financing, going back to what the numbers around adaptation, that sort of financing, you need grants and concessionary finance, deeply concessionary finance to address adaptation in many situations. I think a well-known economist, whose name I won't mention, but said, we can't finance our way out of climate change. That's exacerbating some of the existing challenges related to debt sustainability, partly caused by climate change, but by many other things, such as, exogenous shocks, such as fuel prices, etc., from wars, and of course the pandemic. So grant and concessionary finance must be a central aspect of the response, and the GST needs to find a common way of tracking that finance. I know that there's the OECD DAC processes, but other countries are outside of that process. And there are flows between so-called south to south flows as well. The GST needs to encapsulate and capture all of that, just so that there's this clear understanding of where potential grant and concessionary finance can come from, and importantly, where it's actually going. Is it going to where it can do the most good as it were? And then coming to the private sector, in particular the private financial sector, and I should say here that this is the solution that I have a strong bias towards this because of the work well, myself and others on this call did last year around looking at net zero commitments of non-state entities. The word trust was mentioned before, has already been mentioned, and trust in relation to the private sector is critical. And I think the GST is a great opportunity to begin to build that trust by clearly identifying private sector players, particularly from the financial sector, that are addressing climate change seriously and putting their money where their mouth is, as it were. And going back again to the example of South Africa's JETP, which requires 60% of financing from the private sector, and it's not just money in terms of what's needed. It's also a comprehensive plan to address, in particular, the just transition elements. And the same could be said of adaptation. They've been called social aspects of our transition to a low carbon resilient economy and society. These social aspects, yes, can come, sometimes funding helps, but it's also the intent. Any planning must put that front and center and integrate it into what's needed. And it's not something that comes naturally to the private sector, I don't think. It's often said, oh, this is the government's role. But on that basis, there needs to be some stronger linkages between what the government sees as needed on the so-called social side and what the private sector can then deliver. There needs to be much stronger interaction between that, and I think between the two. And I do think that the Stocktake is a really important opportunity to be able to do that. And finally, just in terms of financing again, is the in general, outside of climate, actually the bond financing is a critical part of most sovereigns' borrowing in general. It has been historically. So in 2021, the World Bank statistics show that for low and middle income countries, the bond holding was more than double borrowing in the bond market was more than double what it was from multilaterals. So while there's been a significant focus on what's happening in the multilateral space, and that's important and must continue, what's happening in the bond space and the bond market space, where it's largely private investors providing that financing, also needs to be linked. And I say it's a natural process in the sense that this is not just related to climate, this is related to sovereign borrowing in general, and surprisingly also in low income countries. So I think there are lots of opportunities to make those links between what's happening in the private sector, both companies and financial institutions and governments, and making sure that adaptation is addressed through grants and concessional finance, but there shouldn't be a question of that in a way in terms of the financing instrument needed. And I also agree with the comment made about new funding mechanisms or new funds. They're important. So, for example, the Loss and Damage Fund last year is fantastic development, but there is a risk that with the plethora of funding, it reduces, each fund needs its own, call it secretariat, skill sets involved, and to be capacitated to deliver what it was set up to do. And the more that there are, it feels that they're less able to do that. So I strongly believe that we should focus on capacitating the existing mechanisms, to both from a funding perspective and from a skills perspective, so that we can actually deliver on what has been promised, and more importantly, what's needed. Thanks.
Many thanks, Malonga, also for addressing JETPs when that wasn't necessarily expected. So thank you for doing that on short notice. Again, you raised a lot. I won't try to summarize it at all. I think it was interesting how strongly you emphasize the importance of the private sector, and that the global stocktake needs to, I think in my words here, needs to build on the momentum towards the role of non-parties that is sort of built up all the way from Paris till now, but really put the private sector much more front and center on the issue of means of implementation and finance. And you cited the fact that the example of the JETP in South Africa is 60% due to come from the private sector, but you also highlighted the notion of trust in the private sector. And of course, this links to interesting issues such as the UN Secretary General's high-level expert group that's looking at accountability of the private sector, and the recently launched initiative by the UNFCCC Executive Secretary around that issue. And as I understand it, that's out to consultation at the moment. So that's something to look at. You also mentioned the importance of concessional finance for adaptation. We're actually doing a convening on adaptation on Wednesday. You might want to join in and ask questions around that. And I'm definitely not an expert, but I'm certainly seeing a lot of news out there in general in relation to the bond market, and the fact that you raised that as an issue is something for the experts who are on the panel and the audience to think about. So what I'm going to do now is, due to my timekeeping, we're running a little bit behind schedule. We've actually have a number of questions here, and I'd like for volunteers in the from our panel to address those. I think the first one I'd actually like to take is you raised, Malongo and others, the importance of finance for adaptation. And as someone who was responsible for that work stream in the UN Secretary General Summit in 2019, I've always wondered how the trillions are going to flow of their own accord out of the G20 and into adaptation. It seems to me that on adaptation, you need some kind of intervention to make those trillions flow. And we have a question here from Swathi Manchikanti, a terrible pronunciation, but Swathi hopefully is not such a bad response. But he or she asks, what can be done to improve the business case for MFIs to better fund adaptation efforts across various sectors? So I don't know who wants to take that. I think maybe this is one for David. I don't know if one of the panel wants to wave at me. I'll give them the floor if they want to answer that question. David, I threw you under the bus, so you go ahead.
I'm happy to jump in, but I think Malongo in her forward just before I'd tackle that on. Just to be clear, if MFIs are multilateral finance institutions or microfinance institutions, because I work in both sides of the aisle, so it could be seen differently. I feel like one of the things Malongo emphasized, and it is critical, is really how to fund these adaptation efforts or social aspects of the transition. And what is key is to have the planning, to have the vision owned by a large number of stakeholders in country to kind of define what are the development priorities, and therefore what is going to be the adaptation priorities, and laid out some sort of investment plans, or at least directions and guidelines, who can then be integrated by a multilateral finance institution as a proportion of what we said, the systems approach or the sector approach that they are targeting in the country. So by having that signal of what is the desirable direction of travel with the vision of a sustained progress, then you can give confidence to investors by bringing public dollars to leverage private dollars to actually support those interventions.
Thanks a lot, David. I see audience members have raised their hand. If you have a question, please do put it in the question and answer function, because we don't have the ability to allow audience members to speak directly. So please do pose your question, and if we have time, we'll come to it. The next one I'd like to go to here has been posted by Tony Ripley. He talks here about fossil fuel subsidy reform. How does the panel think that inefficient subsidies can be identified, and how can their removal or repurposing be incentivized or encouraged? Who'd like to take that one? Alejandro, go ahead.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks everyone for the really good feedback on what we wrote. This is a really critical question, and one that is not easy to answer. But the premise that we have in this paper around subsidies is that they are socially regressive. So they actually benefit the top 20 percentile in societies. So that is that they receive over 40% of benefits, and something needs to be done around that. But indeed, it is not only about prices and costs, but also to try to integrate or internalize the cost of environmental hazards and climate change. And when it comes to climate change, all fossil fuel subsidies are inefficient. So I think this goes to what was mentioned by both David and Sandra about net climate finance. So we have to start looking at how to increase climate financing, but also to decrease whatever is minimizing our efforts. And from that perspective, these will have consequences, social consequences, because it's not easy simply to raise the price of fuels anywhere. So that's why the way we phrased our solution is not phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, rather reforming fossil fuel subsidies. That is, there is a necessity to look carefully at how these subsidies can then be reconfigured and swapped into the kind of financing that can go to renewable energies and other types of climate action that actually benefit those that have been benefiting from the fossil fuel subsidies in a manner that is socially crafted. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Alejandra. I'm going to take some more and then maybe play back some of the poll results if I can figure out how to do that. We had a question here from Alden Meyer in Washington, DC. I think I'm going to give this one to Juan Pablo, which is basically asking about how the public sector finance can be used to leverage greater flow of private sector finance. Do we have models that are proven to work that can be scaled up? Do we need new approaches? Can I give that one to you, Juan Pablo?
Sure, thanks. So I think it's important again, and I think this is inferring the question to sort of realize public sector finance alone is not going to move the needle here, but precisely sort of how it can play a catalytic role. I think some of the examples that have been already mentioned with regards to the role of GSTs and sort of how public finance can play a role there without being the main channel already exemplifies sort of the current trends on this. But I think generally we need to think, and this goes back a little bit to my earlier point on sort of strengthening countries' capacity to do proper structuring, is to be able for countries to engage in blended finance and be able to make the most of every one of the every dollar that they have available from public sources to be able to de-risk our investment. We have incredible potential that is quite untapped in the developing world for guarantees, whether from political risks to sort of the more traditional project finance guarantees. This is sort of quite challenging for a lot of countries to engage in this type of conversations, and it represents incredible potential for the use of public sources. In the same way that sort of some of these subsidies, and I think that this goes to the point just made in terms of how we think of restructuring some of these subsidies that we've been using for decades. How do we use them to address market failures and do it in a way that it's part of a process rather than just sort of like a sharp end overnight? We also want to think about sort of the role that tax breaks can play with regards to the role of public sector finance and sort of providing the right type of incentives. I think generally also in terms of sort of the enabling frameworks that public sectors provide, I think it's frankly quite outrageous that if we think of setting up a wind turbine in Germany versus setting up a wind turbine somewhere in Kenya, the type of credit that the public sector is able to access, or that even private sector is able to access, is just so different. And this is something that we need to sort of be looking at again in the context of the system, because public sector alone is not going to be able to do it, but setting up the right frameworks is going to be quite key in terms of the regulation to remove the barriers that are making it very challenging to have an equal playing field. I guess it's only really through the combination of sort of this setting up of the enabling environment and using every dollar for de-risking investment that we can get to some of these challenges, and that hopefully the next round of NDCs will start thinking of sort of this blended finance approach, building on experiences like the GST to be able to make the most of every dollar for the energy transition.
Thanks a lot, Juan Pablo. Hopefully, Alden, that answers your question. I'm trying to make sure that we don't miss any of the questions here. We had a couple of questions from Sarah Finney. One of them was referring to Malongo's intervention, and I think asking whether there's some information or link to that. I don't know if Malongo, if you can have a look at that question and maybe post a link in the chat, or we could try to do that afterwards. Sarah also asked whether there's any efforts being made in the mainstream media on these kind of issues. I think there are efforts, and there's certainly some initiatives that are starting to take form in terms of trying to coordinate some clear messaging around some of these issues. But it's really incumbent on everybody in the audience and on the panel here to start doing that. And it's one of the reasons why we're doing this, is to try to identify which are the key messages, because if everybody asks for everything, we're going to come out with nothing. And at this point, we really need to start sending some clear signals, particularly for the media. We have a question from Rajesh, which is, could you please put some light on who's watching the financial transactions of the developed world as they promised on the 100 billion? I'm kind of looking at Lorena here because she's done a lot of work in her career on tracking the 100 billion. Can I throw you under the bus on that? I mean, I think we've kind of touched on it, but I know there's efforts by the OECD and others. And I think one of the problems, as I understand it, is that the answer to whether the 100 billion has been achieved is always sort of 2 years behind. But maybe Lorena, you could answer that one.
Thank you, Cabe. Happy to jump in on this one. And I believe it's important to acknowledge, on the one hand, the reporting lag that you already flagged. So there are some times in which we're trying to answer questions of what is happening in 2023, but the latest available information that we have that is actually comparable under the UNFCCC or the OECD DAC reporting systems is only from 2019 or 2020. In this case, this lag of 2 years in the reporting system is something that perhaps is an element to consider when trying to do these global assessments of where things stand, but also links back to something that has been flagged during the conversation, which is this cross-cutting element about disclosure and transparency of information that is provided. And there are many opportunities in terms of how we go about the specific components of mobilized private finance. This is a persistent gap in terms of how things are reported under the UNFCCC. And it also links back to one of the specific signals that is being identified in the technical paper in terms of how do we transition from these voluntary initiatives trying to incentivize private stakeholders to report on what their plans are and what they are intending to do in the next few years, into some of these mandatory requirements for disclosure of information. And it also goes back to some of these efforts in terms of what the UN Secretary General has been trying to do. It has to do with the accountability element in the whole system and how we go about making sense and comparing, being able to compare some of these sources of information. There are different methodological approaches used. And this is something to bear in mind. It's part of the difficulty of the system that has been created under the UNFCCC, in which it would depend on which source of information you consult. You will have different estimates on where we stand. But what is clear across the board is that we are nowhere close to where we need to be. And that's the fact that we need to address at this point, in part also as the outcomes of the GST are available. I want to say one more thing, Kaveh, if I may, in terms of this challenge of communicating to broader audiences what's happening. And there might be an opportunity here in terms of creating a sequencing as well with other processes that are underway. And several elements that were mentioned by Malango, by Juan Pablo, and more recently by Alejandra as well, have to do with established tracks under the G20 process and some of the expectations of what is going to happen this year as part of the Climate Week and the high-level segment of the General Assembly in New York in September. So there might be some opportunities there to also zoom in into some of the specific expectations of deliverables for these processes that might contribute to build this momentum in terms of not only communicating to specialized audiences, but trying to also create some appealing incentives for broader audiences to engage in this process and to have a little bit of more active engagement, if that may be possible during this year and running up to Dubai.
Thanks a lot, Lorena, also for touching on that question about clear messaging, including from the media. Sandra, did you also want to come in on this question of the 100 billion?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Kaveh. Just a couple of things and very just complemented with what Lorena said, and I totally agree. I think this discussion about the 100 billion and, you know, this a commitment that was set 14 years ago, and it's still relevant just because it is a commitment that if it is not complied, if it is not achieved, then it's creating a huge kind of a trust gap among parties. And I think there are two elements that are very, very relevant, and I think you wrote it in the report as well. The fact that we don't have a climate finance definition, and as Lorena was saying, the lack of a common methodology is creating a huge gap in terms of understanding. Just in Paris, Emmanuel Macron was questioned by lots of people because they commented that in June this year, the 100 billion were transferring from developed to developing countries. So according to the OECD countries, the 100 billion were already achieved this year. And a lot of people ask, no, where is the money? And according to Emmanuel Macron, they will produce a report that will present it in the COP to show where this 100 billion, according to the OECD countries, has been allocated. And I think it's also important in just connecting with what we have been saying, the role of non-governmental organizations, the role of these think tanks that are putting together shadow reports. Oxfam just produced a report about the 100 billion, showing that according to different definitions, the 100 billion haven't been achieved. And this is precisely the point about methodologies and the enhanced transparency framework that is going to be in place or is in place in the UNFCCC as well. So important, because if we are just counting pears and apples continually and we continue with this lack of understanding, obviously, the money is flowing, that's for sure, but to what extent is going towards where needs to be allocated, there is a massive gap. And I just wanted to emphasize also this last point about the role of the private sector. I think it's no one questions the need of the private sector as part of the mobilization of resources, but I think it's very important to kind of considering what has been committed by developed countries to developing countries as part of that commitment in the long run, and what can be mobilized with the participation of the private sector. And I would like to triple emphasize what Lorena said, moving from these voluntary approaches to more like regulatory approaches, because the only way that the financial sector will be transformed is if they have like strong rules and regulations in place to really transform. Otherwise, we will continue talking about the role of the private sector without that necessarily obligation side. And with that in place, we are not going to be able to mobilize the right amount of money with the right amount or under the right principles, which is another big issue, no? To what extent we are complying with the human rights respect and gender balance in all these allocations that are flowing around. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sandra. We have 6 minutes left, and I'd like to bring in Malongo, particularly on that last point that Sandra raised about the importance of the private sector, which you really emphasized quite strongly in the first intervention. Do you have any sort of parting thoughts or wisdom on that? Malongo, over to you.
Well, yes, just to say on the regulation side, I fully agree. Regulations need to be put in place to ensure, particularly just starting with disclosure, for example, but also the need for transition plans, etc. That can only come from regulation. But regulation needs to be really well informed, because bad regulation doesn't help anybody. So in terms of, and to respond in part to Alden's question about mobilizing private finance, on a very basic level, assessments need to be made. And from experience in speaking with companies and indeed banks, with the advent of taxonomies, green taxonomies, a lot of banks are saying, oh, but we're funding that stuff. We just didn't call it adaptation or didn't call it green, or and similarly with companies. So I do think a lot more assessment needs to happen in country, led by governments, to identify what's actually happening on the ground, because as much as the private sector does things quite badly, but they do respond well to risk. So in Mozambique, for example, there's a shared water basin. And often looking at things at a water basin level allows shared risk to come forward more clearly. So there's this area in Mozambique floods often, and there were two large South African companies there who actually came together. Two big sugar companies came together with government to say, how do we address flood risk? And that's an adaptation response, but it's also a response to them for business risk. There's a shared basin between Mozambique, South Africa, and Eswatini. And I think that those are examples of where the private sector can be brought in from a different angle. You're not necessarily saying it's climate, but you're addressing a risk. So I think yeah, the assessment aspect needs to be made much better, and capacity building to allow that to happen in country, I think, is really important.
Thanks a lot, Malongo. And again, that notion of capacity building again, right at the very end, reiterating a point earlier. And if Sarah reaches out to C2US and gives us your contact details, we'll send Malongo's source for that question that you asked earlier. And then we haven't forgotten about you, Tracy. You posted a question about the form of the outcome of the GST. I'm going to take that very quickly because we've got 2.5 minutes. Essentially, the thesis of our project is that the signals coming out of the GST and COP28 need to be clear, and they need to be a defined number. So not everything, but some very clear ideas that would come out, whether it's in the decision, the political declaration, or otherwise. There needs to be a limited number. And we haven't talked about it, but the Global Stocktake also needs to set up or remind parties and the private sector that there's a year gap between the end of COP28 and the submission of the new NDCs in the first quarter of 2025. And there's a very clear implication that 2024 needs to be used effectively to help countries and the private sector to raise their ambition and implement promises already made. So I'm just going to ask Philip very quickly to share the poll results on screen, if we have them. I don't know if people can see that clearly or not. I'm finding it a little bit difficult to see. But the conclusion is that we don't have a particularly strong favorite. But if I had to say, I would say that solutions 1, 2, and 3 are the ones that have come out on top. But also, interestingly, at least half of you think that there are better solutions out there than the ones that we have identified ourselves. We'll find a way of sharing that with participants afterwards, but there's clearly a bit more homework for Juliana, Alejandra, Jennifer, and I to do. And the last thing I would like to do is thank our panel very much for taking the time to join us. This webinar will be posted on YouTube and will be shared with registrants. So please do have a look at that and share it with other people. We will be having a similar webinar tomorrow on mitigation, which there will be obviously a very clear financial component to that and a means of implementation component, and also issues such as raised by Malongo and others. Will be looking at adaptation and loss and damage on Wednesday. So please do join us for that. And I would also very much like to thank Alejandra, Juliana, Jennifer, and Philip for helping set up this webinar, and also to all of our participants. So thank you very much indeed for joining us, and we are exactly on time. I hope you have a good evening or afternoon where you are, and thanks again. Bye.